problem P1, and McLennan Company had an accounts receivable balance of $320,000 and a credit balance in allowance for uncollectible accounts of $16,700 at January 1st, 2014. During the year, the company recorded the following transactions. Sales on accounts were $1,052,000. Sales returns and allowances by credit customers, $53,400. Collections from customers, $993,000. Worthless accounts written off, $19,800. The company's past history indicates that 2.5% of its net credit sales will not be collected. So the first step we have to do is to prepare T accounts for accounts receivable and allowance for uncollectible accounts. Enter the beginning balances and show the effects on these accounts of the items listed above, summarizing the year's activity. Determine the ending balance of each account. So the first thing we're going to do is create the T accounts, accounts receivable, allowance for doubtful accounts. So what we've got is you're going to first start with T accounts. On the first one, you're going to show a T account. Well, then I'll make it myself here. Do I have the right? Yeah. So here we've got accounts receivable. So this first part, make it a T account. Another example for you would be to trying to pull up Excel. There it goes. Anytime. Well, it's taking forever. I'm just going to minimize that. Do you see right here, this is a T account. It says accounts receivable. Here's the T here, and it goes down right here. And then this one, allowance for uncollectible accounts, here's the T here, okay? So the first thing they want us to do is to put in the beginning balances. Well, if we go back here, it tells us the accounts receivable balance is $320,000. So what we'll do is we'll start with balance $320,000. Okay? Then it also tells us the balance for the allowance and uncollectible is a credit balance of $16,700. So where will we put that? Credit over here, $16,700. Everyone got that so far? Yes? Okay. Next, it tells us, too much stuff up here. Next, it tells us we need to enter these balances and then show the effects on the accounts. The next one says sales on account $1,052,000. Now think of it, when there's a sale that happens, we debit accounts receivable and we credit sales, don't we? Well, all we're caring about right now is the accounts receivable. So we're going to go in here and debit under A, credit sales for $1,052,000. Okay? Then the next step, it tells us sales returns and allowances by credit customers is $53,400. So if we received returns from customers on credit of $53,400, we're going to reduce our accounts receivable by that much. So do you see over here B? It's got a credit, sales returns and allowances of $53,400. We're going to credit that. Does that make sense? Next, it says to us, collections from customers, $993,000. When we receive cash from customers, what happens to our accounts receivable? It goes down. So our accounts receivable here, you see C, collection from customers, $993,000 is a credit. Make sense? Next, it says worthless accounts written off, $19,800. What do we do with that? Worthless accounts written off. Do you see how if we are going to write them off, we reduce our accounts receivable? D, $19,800. You see that? And the corresponding entry is an allowance for uncollectible accounts of $19,800. So you see here at D, we debit write-offs $19,800. Okay? So then try to do it on your own. See what your ending accounts receivable balance is by doing those and your allowance for uncollectible accounts. What do you find those to be? You should have our beginning balance of accounts receivable was a debit of $320. We added to it credit sales of a debit of $1,052,000. And then if we subtract from that total our sales returns and allowances of $53,400, our collections from customers of $993,000, and our write-offs of $19,800, we should end with a debit balance of $305,800 in accounts receivable. And then with our allowance for uncollectibles, we started with a credit balance of $16,700. We wrote off $19,800. This leaves us with a debit balance of $3,100. Okay? So that's the starting point of what we're going to do for the next piece. Now the next piece says, compute the uncollectible accounts expense Determine the ending balance of allowance for uncollectible accounts and net accounts receivable under two different methods: the percentage of net sales method and the accounts receivable aging method, assuming an aging of the accounts receivable shows that $24,000 may be uncollectible. So let's take the first one. Under the percentage of net sales method, it tells us the company's past history indicates that 2.5% of its net sales, credit sales, will not be collected. Okay? 2.5% of its net credit sales. So what are its net credit sales? What are we going to use, guys? I'm sorry, what? 52. And we're going to subtract our returns and allowances, won't we? The returns and allowances of $53,400 gives us times 0.25 gives us our uncollectible account expense should be $24,965. Right? Now, if we look at, we have a balance here of a debit balance of $3,100, don't we? If we show our $24,965 as a credit and we have a debit of $3,100, what will our new balance in our allowance for doubtful accounts be, or uncollectible accounts? Would it be the difference? A credit balance of $21,865. Maybe I should go pull up a Microsoft Excel so I can. Okay. So if, let me just do our allowance for uncollectible accounts. Remember, right now we have a balance of $3,100 in it, a debit balance. If we take that, and what is our credit now? 2.5% of sales is what? $24,965. If that is a credit, won't our new debit balance be this minus our debit will give us a new credit balance of $21,865? Does that make sense? That's under the percentage of sales method. But if we go the other method, if we do it the accounts receivable aging method, we're going to do it a little different. The accounts, that was $21,865. The accounts receivable net is going to be that $3,058. Then we're going to subtract our $21,865. So let me go over here. Let me make this accounts receivable. This was a $305, right? Net? $305,800. And if we are going to $305,800, and from there, if we reduce our accounts receivable by the 21,865 less our 21,865, what is our new net balance in our accounts receivable? Perfect. Okay? Now, let's see how we do it under the other method. Under the aging method, we've got these balances still. This is the percent of sales. Now under the accounts receivable aging method, okay, it says to us, the accounts receivable aging method, assume an aging of the accounts receivable shows that 24,000 may be uncollectible. Okay? So what we're going to do here is, if we know 24,000 is going to be uncollectible, we then have to plug in the amount that we're going to use for our uncollectible account expense. So if right now our allowance for uncollectibles is at 3,100 debit, okay, and we know we want to get this to 24,000, what do we need to credit here? 27,100. Okay? That's what we're going to need to credit, the 27,100 to get us there. So, what we ultimately want is an allowance of 24,000 here. Excuse me, an allowance of 24,000. So in order to get that allowance of 24,000, what are we going to need to debit and credit? We're going to debit our allowance for doubtful account or bad debt expense, okay? Bad debt expense of how much? 27,100, and we're going to credit our allowance for doubtful accounts or uncollectibles of 27,100 also. Is that right? Now, as you see, the net of accounts receivable, we want to reduce it by 24,000, don't we? So our new balance in our accounts receivable net is going to be this. We're going to take away 24,000 to end up with a new accounts receivable balance of 281,800. The tricky part here is when we're dealing with the aging method, we know what we want our allowance to end up at, so we have to plug in the figure. That's where it's trickier. The other method actually is easier. Does that make sense? Let's do another problem like it, guys. I think we did some of these. Did we do E7A? Should we try E7A? Does that help you? Yes, no? Sure. Why don't you guys take 4 minutes and try it on your own first, okay? Let's look at this E7A. Norcia Company, which uses the allowance method, began the year with accounts receivable of $32,500 and an allowance for uncollectible accounts of a $3,200 credit. So what will you have in your accounts receivable? A debit balance of $32,500 or a credit balance of $32,500? Debit of $32,500, and you'll see it right here. Debit of $32,500. Your credit for allowance for uncollectibles is $3,200, okay? The company sold merchandise to Bruce Willis for $3,600 and later received $1,200 from Willis. The rest of the amount due from Willis had to be written off as uncollectible. Using T accounts, show the beginning balances and the effects of the Willis transaction on accounts receivable and allowance for uncollectible accounts. What is the amount of net accounts receivable before and after the write-off? So it sold $3,600 to Willis, right? So accounts receivable is going to have a debit of $3,600. Then we receive cash of $1,200 from Willis, right? So then we're at a balance of $34,900, aren't we? But $3,600 minus $1,200 that Willis paid us is a difference of how much? $2,400. We have to write $2,400 of Willis's balance off, don't we? Because we're not going to get the money. So do you see in accounts receivable, we credited $2,400 to come up with a new balance now of $32,500? So to remove that balance from accounts receivable that he owes us, we have to credit accounts receivable $2,400 to have a new balance of $32,500. Our offsetting debit is to have to debit our allowance for uncollectible accounts of $2,400. So our credit of $3,200 minus our $2,400 write-off gives us a balance in our allowance for uncollectibles of $800, doesn't it? Make sense? Now what this next piece is trying to show us is the two go together. Remember, our accounts receivable minus our allowance gives us, which we call the contra account, gives us our net accounts receivable. Before we wrote off Willis's amount he owed, we had a balance here, you see, of $34,900. And we had an allowance of uncollectible prior to it of $3,200. So our $34,900 minus our $3,200 gave us a net accounts receivable of $31,700. Then after we took care of everything, our accounts receivable balance is $32,500. Our new allowance for uncollectibles is $800. And our net amount still, our net accounts receivable still is $31,700. Why? Because we record this account based on our history of uncollectibles. Therefore, when we get a bad debt expense, we've got the net amount still showing. But when we identify and recognize whose account we're in fact writing off, it's ultimately still going to be the same net accounts receivable because we're taking it out of our allowance and offsetting it into our accounts receivable. Let's look at another one, guys. Would you like to do another one? I think we did do E4, didn't we? Or E5?
E5 we didn't.
We did not do E5? Okay.
I don't think we did either of those.
Okay, you don't think E4? Okay, let's do E4. E4 says, at the beginning of 2014, the balances for accounts receivable and allowance for uncollectible accounts were $215,000, and the allowance for uncollectibles had a credit balance of $15,700. During the year, credit sales were $1,600,000, and collections on account were $1,475,000. In addition, $17,500 in uncollectible accounts was written off. Using T accounts determined the year-end balances of accounts receivable and allowance for uncollectible accounts. Then prepare the year-end adjusting entry to record the uncollectible accounts expense under each of the following conditions. Also, show the year-end balance sheet presentation of accounts receivable and allowance for uncollectible accounts. So the first thing we're going to do with E4 is to present our T accounts. So our T account for accounts receivable starts with a balance of $215,000. Our allowance for uncollectibles has a credit balance of $15,700. Now it told us that we had credit sales of $1,600,000. So we know that that is going to be a debit to our accounts receivable of $1,600,000. Then it also told us that we received collections or money of $1,475,000. So we'll also credit then the accounts receivable of $1,475,000. Then it told us that the write-offs that we had to write off on the account was $17,500. As you see here, look how we have to do it. We have to credit our accounts receivable since we're writing off $17,500, and the corresponding entry will be a debit to our write-offs of $17,500. Okay? So we have an ending balance in our accounts receivable of $322,800 by our balance plus our credit sales minus our collections minus our write-offs gives us a balance of $322,500. Our allowance for uncollectibles had a beginning credit balance of $15,700. Since we had to write off $17,500, you see our debit side is bigger than our credit side. So we end up with a debit balance here of $1,800. Does that make sense? Now the next thing it says, management estimates the percentage of uncollectible credit sales to be 1.2% of total credit sales. So we are required here, post the results of each of the entries to the T account for allowance for uncollectible accounts. So if we estimate the uncollectible credit sales to be 1.2% of total credit sales, well, how's that going to work? 1 1,600,000 minus our, 1,600,000 times 1.2% gives us 19,200. So in this type of method for uncollectibles, all we do then is take our sales times the percent of uncollectibles, and we're going to debit our uncollectible account expense to 19.2, and we're going to credit allowance for uncollectibles of 19.2. Now you see, in doing that, if we had $15,700 as a write-off, 15,700 was our balance, and then we had write-offs of 17,500. Well, if we in fact use this method, the percent of sales method, we then have 19,200 that gets credited to this account to give us an ending balance in our allowance for uncollectibles of 17,400. So as you see, the way we'll present this is our accounts receivable of $322,500 minus our contra account allowance for uncollectibles of 17,400 gives us our accounts receivable net of $305,100. Now we're going to look at the other method. Based on an aging of accounts receivable, management estimates the end of year uncollectible accounts receivable to be $19,350. Now remember, on this we have to plug in the number. So we know under the aging method we want our allowance to be $19,350. We want it to be $19,350. We currently have a debit balance in our allowance for uncollectibles of $1,800. Do you see up here how we had our balance of $1,800 in here? If we wanted the credit balance to be $19,350, what do we have to do, guys? We have to add the two. We have to make a debit to the uncollectible account expense of $21,150, and we then need to credit our allowance for uncollectible accounts to be $21,150. We have to do it at that to get the balance to $19,350. Think of it like this. If this is right now $1,800, and we want this to be what, guys? $350? If we want this to be $19,350, what do we need to plug in here? Something more than $19,350, don't we? Because that $1,800 is a debit balance. So we need to show the $21,150, right? So as you see here, we debit our uncollectible account expense, $21,150. We credit our allowance for uncollectibles to be $21,150. And the way we'll show it on the balance sheet is our accounts receivable balance of $322,500 minus, what is our balance on our allowance for uncollectibles? $19,350, isn't it? Gives us our net accounts receivable of $303,150. This is probably one of the toughest pieces that you'll have in this class. To be able to distinguish between those two methods is the key here. Now, let's take a moment to try to do E5A on your own, and then we'll go over it, okay? It's going to be just like E4A. E5A says, during 2014, DeLuca Company had net sales of $5,700,000. Most of the sales were on credit. At the end of 2014, the balance of accounts receivable was $700,000, and allowance for uncollectible accounts had a debit balance. Guys, get that? Debit balance of $24,000. DeLuca's management uses two methods of estimating uncollectible accounts expense: the percentage of net sales method and the accounts receivable aging method. The percentage of uncollectible sales is 1.5% of net sales. And based on an aging of accounts receivable, the end of year uncollectible accounts total $70,000. Prepare the year-end adjusting entry to record the uncollectible accounts expense under each method. What will the balance of allowance for uncollectible accounts be after each adjustment? Why are the results different? Which method is likely to be more reliable and why? I want you to take 10 minutes and let's try to do this together, okay? Can you try it on your own first? DeLuca had net sales of $5,700,000, which really doesn't matter right now for us. Most of the sales were on credit. At the end of 2014, the balance of accounts receivable was $700,000, and the allowance for uncollectibles had a debit balance of $24,000. So what we'll do is I'm just going to make my own, okay, here. I'll actually go in here. Too many of these things. Control. There, I want to up. Okay, so what we'll do is our accounts receivable had a balance of what?
$700,000.
So accounts receivable here, balance of $700,000. And our allowance had what?
$24,000. Debit.
Okay?
But I thought it said at the end of the year, so aren't all the figures supposed to add up to that?
Well, it's telling us we're going to need this net sales because of figuring out the amount that should be uncollectible. But it's basically saying at the end of the year, before we go and figure all this out, it started with this. DeLucas Management uses two methods of estimating it. The method of uncollectibles, the percentage of uncollectible sales is 1.5% of net sales. So what we know is to figure out this method using the percent of net sales, we need to take 1.5% of how much? 5,700,000, right? So what is 1.5% of 5,700,000?
85,500.
Is, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
85,500.
Times 1% equals 85,500, right? So that's the amount that we are going to show is uncollectible, right? So the debit would be a debit to uncollectible accounts expense for 85,500 and a credit to allowance for uncollectible accounts for 85,500. So our debit would be uncollectible debt, what is it, bad debt, or the bottom line is it's an expense for 85,500. The next is an allowance for uncollectible for 85,500. We're going to put this 85,500, guys, up here, aren't we? Right? 85,500. And then what is our new balance after we put this 85,500 in? Should it be 61,500? Right? So it would end up being the allowance for uncollectible accounts should be 61,500. The 85,500 minus the 24,000 gives us 61,500. Right? So if we were to record our net accounts receivable, I don't know if it asks us to do this. No, it doesn't. But if we were to record our net accounts receivable, wouldn't we show accounts receivable of 700,000 and then allowance for uncollectible would be minus 61,500 to be accounts receivable net of the difference? Come on. How about this? Sum. Should the net really be 638,500?
Yeah.
Okay. Now the next method I think is a little trickier. The next method says, based on an aging of accounts receivable, the end of year uncollectible accounts total $70,000. What does that tell me? That tells me I have to go in here, and if I know this debit balance is at 24, what does my end balance need to be? What did it tell me? 70,000. So under the aging method, it gives us this number. We have to plug in the difference, don't we? Right? So what is our debit going to be? If we know that we need 70,000 and right now our balance is at 24,000, we need to add them together, which means what is our credit side? 94,000. So under the aging method, our debit to our uncollectible bad debt expense is 94,000. Our allowance for uncollectibles is 94,000. Remember, under the percent of sales method, we just take the percent of sales and come up with a new allowance account. Under the aging method, it gives us what the allowance needs to be at the ending balance. Does that make sense? Yes? No?